For our next presentation, we have Dr. Bob Hutmacher. I've known Bob for quite some time. He's done some really groundbreaking and important work in irrigation nitrogen management of cotton. Did a lot of work with Pima cotton, and I met him back on the buried drip studies that he was doing back when I worked for Nenafim. Great guy. And fortunately, he's dove into a very important topic right now that we need a lot of information on in a hurry. And so Bob and the rest of his cooperators are really being brave and doing some important work for us on industrial hemp. And so Bob will be talking today on hemp for essential oils, water and nutrient management considerations. It's a topic that everybody wants answers for. So briefly, Bob is at the Cooperative Extensions. He's a Cooperative Extension Specialist at this and the Center Director for the University of California's Westside Research and Education Center. And Bob has a PhD in crop physiology and a master's in soil physics from Texas Tech. In Bob's assignment with the University of California since 1997, he has research and extension education responsibilities for cotton production in California. And along with Bob's work in cotton, he also conducts irrigation and nutrient management research on several other very important agronomic crops in the San Joaquin Valley, including and not exclusively industrial hemp. So with that, Bob, take it away, and I really appreciate you working on this for us. We all need your help.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation to participate in the conference and to provide some general information in a crop that's, I'll have to admit, is relatively new to me and probably many of you as well, industrial hemp. I'm not reporting on a specific research project really today, but rather just going to present some general basics and information, a few things that we've learned. Dan Putnam and a number of other people that I'll try to describe or mention during the course of the talk in some work that we've started in 2019 and have continued in 2020. So some of the people, certainly Dan Putnam has been conducting the work up at UC Davis, Charlie Brummer and Jake Uretsky with the Plant Sciences Department at UC Davis. I'll mention George Angelis has been coordinating a lot of the work with me at the Westside Research and Extension Center. Okay, so why is hemp production an option, and why hasn't it been in the past? Well, it basically boils down to some changes that are very recent in the federal farm bill that basically allowed the states to develop some regulatory means to manage and monitor production of hemp as a non-marijuana type of cannabis, and that involves a need for and a mandate to verify that you're growing a low THC concentration plant, and I'll mention a little more about that later. But basically all the states have to come up with a state-monitored regulatory sampling testing approach to verify that you meet a target of being less than 0.3% THC in defined regulated plant parts in order to be able to grow the crop. So last year we had quite a few people that jumped into it. There was estimates as of August of about 18,000 acres that actually made it in California, and certainly in many other states in the US as well. And there were a lot of activity from the standpoint of breeders. And then in 2020, just because of a very mixed batch of experiences that people had, and issues with harvest methods, issues with actually what you could sell on the market. There were some failures in 2019, but also probably in general lower acreage in 2020, but still continuing interest, at least from the people that I've been in contact with. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions or only partial answers after these initial efforts and experiences that growers have had. Best management practices for irrigation and nitrogen, pest and disease management and those issues, harvest methods, short-term or long-term storage of the harvested product, decisions on processing and extraction methods, markets, and how do you actually get paid for the product. So it's a very widely adapted crop. It's one that there is actually quite a bit of information available in the literature, but a lot of this sort of screeched to a halt back in the 40s in terms of hemp production in the United States due to concerns with cannabis as marijuana. So it's a crop that's very widely adapted. There are types for fiber, grain production, medicinal, and psychoactive materials such as THC. And most of the hemp production in recent years was dominated by China with over 65%, France about 20% of the world market, but also significant activity in Canada, Eastern and Southern Europe, and then more recently now in the United States. There's a lot of varieties that are dioecious and others that are monoecious. Most of the commercial ones probably are dioecious that are being grown. A broadleaf plant, tap-rooted. There's, as I'll talk about in a minute, a lot of variety in branching and number of flower clusters. And one important thing is that many of the cultivars are photoperiod sensitive short day plants, but not all. Next slide. Yep, we gave you an easy one here to start with, but it's actually a good way of pointing out that this is sort of the all-important thing you need to be concerned about if you're, at least at this point, in terms of regulatory controls. It's vital that you keep in mind that you have to be growing a crop that has a THC level of less than 0.3%. It's a federal mandate. And if you don't meet that target, well, then your crop is going to get destroyed. Okay. So there's a lot of options, as I mentioned, of what type of products that you can grow if you're growing hemp. And so the choices are defined by what you're planning to sell or trying to sell and the chemical composition that's required. So potential products, as mentioned, are grain for supplements, seed-based oil or flour that can be used for cooking or other food purposes. There's a lot of potential uses for fiber as well as structural materials based on the stem, fibrous kind of characteristics, and then pharmaceutical, medicinal extracts, so CBD, the other cannabinoids, and terpenes. And a lot of variation in what somebody thinks is the best bet for California, but I guess, Dan Putnam and I, when we kicked this around, just decided that, the early work that we would work on would be focused on the essential oils, CBD types, seemed to where, at least last year, where the grower primary interest was. And that's based on, climate issues, competing land uses, processing costs, harvest issues, and competition, because this can be produced in a lot of other U.S. states as well. So we thought probably medicinal extracts and maybe seed for planting would be something of potential interest as a California market. There certainly are some impacts of your choice of harvestable product on what kind of farming methods would be used, and that's a real critical thing. So if you want to produce fiber or you want to produce something that's going to be taken all the way to grain or seed production, then these typically are ones that have been very high density planting, so almost more like the kind of planting densities for a small grains crop. And with those kind of planting rates, then you have to have low cost seed. And so not all hemp seed is alike. If you were looking at the marketplace last year, you could see seed varieties that were available for fiber or grain production that are the types that you buy by the pound. And because you needed a lot of seed for these kind of plantings, low cost or relatively low cost seed. And you want a lot of biomass and long fiber types in order to do the fiber production. You want a lot of seed if you're going to produce the seed production. And in contrast, if you're producing for cannabinoid or terpene production, these are generally going to be very low planting densities relative to the ones I just mentioned for grain or fiber. So about 2 to 5% of the population that you would use for grain or fiber. And a big driver on that is the very high cost of the seed or transplants. Most of the production methods discussed, at least in the last year in the industry, have been using feminized plants, so mostly female flowers. You want to rogue out the male plants. And part of the basic idea, I guess, behind some of that is that pollination can impact or reduce CBD yields as the seed is set. And there are also some other concerns for compatibility issues if you're doing production of different types of industrial hemp in the same area. So goals would be to select the varieties, manage for CBD essential oils, for instance, while avoiding that too high THC limit. There's been some other discussion about dual purpose production, such as harvest for CBD and fiber, for instance, out of the same crop. And that might be possible, but you're going to run again into the same kind of issues with planting density that's optimum for CBD versus and cost of seed versus planting densities that are going to produce adequate amounts of biomass. There's also a lot of diversity in plant characteristics that are important to recognize in kind of making choices on industrial hemp and how you might grow it. So there's a lot of diversity that's known and has been documented in flowering types, as I mentioned. Most of commercial types are dioecious, but some are monoecious. Growth habit, as I'll mention in a minute. There's some that are autoflower, non-photoperiod sensitive types that go from about 15 to 18 inches to over 10 feet tall. Lots of differences in cultivars in branching, and that's also impacted by density, photoperiod sensitivity to short days, duration of harvest, of timing from planting to harvest, which might range from 70 to over 140 days, fiber and grain productivity, if that's what you're going for, chemical composition, what the profile is of the cultivar, big differences across cultivars in CBD, CBG, THC profiles, and then not a whole lot appears to be known, at least from reviewing the literature, about stress responses, or for that matter, insect and disease resistance in, say, areas such as our semi-arid West. So lots of areas of potential study for advancing things with breeders. So the next one, a major thing to look at if you're making considerations about how you're going to produce this crop is photoperiod sensitivity. And the ones that we've just have some experience with, Dan Putnam initiated a trial last year that we ended up doing at Davis as well as at Westside Research Center, focusing on planting density with autoflower genotypes. And the autoflower are ones that are day neutral. So it's a very different type of thing in terms of a production decision if you're producing a photoperiod sensitive short day plant versus one that's day neutral. So the day neutral one, for instance, could be grown in the summer. It could be planted in the spring and harvested early summer. Could be late summer planted and harvested in the fall. So again, lots of opportunities there that are quite different. Photoperiod sensitive plants are ones that generally you're going to have a much more defined period for summer production. Next slide. Okay, well, most of them, you can focus on whatever you want as a grower, but the commercially available types that are out there right now are both short day photoperiod types and day neutral types. And so you have options that you can make a choice on depending on what area of the state you're in and those kind of particulars. Okay, the reason why this planting density is important really for the CBD types at least is the costs, at least in these early days of the industry, for feminized seed or transplants are really high or have been, and there's limited seed availability. So you've probably heard, if you've followed any of the last year discussion of a Christmas tree type of planting. So this is just an example showing a 60-inch bed with one plant per 25 square feet. Autoflower types would be planted higher density because the plants tend to be generally smaller, and then you jump to really high density, maybe 100,000 plus plants per acre for grain or fiber types. One term that you'll hear over and over if you're talking about CBD or terpene type of production is a cola, and that's basically the flower cluster that'll be on the plant and at the ends and middles of branches. And then a lot of the material is produced of interest, CBD or the terpenes is produced in higher concentrations in this portion of the plant. And you can see that in the trichomes, the calyx portion of these flower structures, the colas. So I'm not going to go into this, but I just wanted to mention there's a lot known about the different types of compounds in essential oils, cannabinoids, and terpenes. So CBG types, CBD types, THC as a And the pathways are fairly well understood for a number of these different types of compounds. What isn't as always well understood is the impacts of management practices such as water stress or environmental conditions on concentrations at different times for these materials. So that's a big potential area for research as well. So it looks like we have another poll here. This is another one of those where everybody did great. You have you can't get a wrong answer here because all of these are potential products for this crop. Okay, good job, everybody. Okay, so I just want to mention a few things then that would be a focus of some of the work Charlie Brummer, Jake Uretsky up at UCD are doing some work on hemp breeding. And just to mention a few things that they would be considering looking at, you know, in terms of trying to make some improvements would be higher CBD concentrations while keeping in mind THC numbers, reduced branching to enable higher density plantings, again, if you can deal with some of the issues on seed costs, and day neutral flowering on a broader cross section of plants. And again, this just shows some of the nursery locations at Davis and Westside last year in the breeding program. CBD versus THC, you know, one of the things here, I'll just make it very brief, is some work was done by Charlie Brummer, Jake Uretsky, Dan Putnam last year, and they found that in a lot of the different varieties that they were looking at in terms of breeding stock, that there was a sort of a link, essentially, a positive relationship between CBD concentration and the harvestable product, part of the plant, and THC. So one of the things you have to be careful of is when you're breeding, if you're going for higher CBD concentrations, you have to also be looking at THC very closely to make sure you're not jumping past those regulatory limits. So again, branching characteristics, one of the things they're looking at, branching, hemp and grain type of production, and again, the characteristics of the colas. I'll mention briefly that at UC Davis, just to let you know, there's quite a bit of activity going on. There's a new hemp center that's been started at UCD that's going to have both a plant science person and a medical school person as directors. Co-directors working on both marijuana types as well as industrial hemp. A lot of work in the chemistry of the different products in the chemistry department. Genomics with Gail Taylor, and then, as I mentioned, the Charlie Brummer breeding program. Crop management issues are areas of concern for producers as well as research. We started in response to the questions from the growers, and so some of the things looked at have been cultivar variety trials, essentially, planting dates and densities, and then observations on pest and disease in these field trials. Agronomic trials, as I mentioned, have then branched out from planting density trials, especially with autoflower, the photoperiod insensitive or day neutral types, to irrigation and water use studies. So the plant density studies have focused on these photoperiod insensitive or day neutral types, and 60-inch beds with 3 different densities, about 7,000, 17,000, and 35,000 plants per acre. And many of those, again, with very high cost seed, may be sort of out of the range that you could actually use. And this just shows some of the responses. Again, some work to be done on these varieties on trying to figure out where optimal planting densities are, but you obviously need lower cost seed if you're trying to hit optimal or even close to peak yields. I'll just mention there's a Western U.S. and a U.S. Efforts being made on water use studies and irrigation responses, mostly under drip irrigation, led by Oregon State University, that some UC people are participating in. And this just shows you some of the range of water applications in the trial that was done at both Westside and at Davis, looking at both early maturing autoflower varieties, again, that mature out and ready for harvest about 85 days or so after planting, and then additional water that would be used if you're looking at late maturing full season cultivars. We've already covered this basically, that the basic focus, if you're looking at essential oils harvest, is the cola and the upper portion of the plant is the portion that you would be harvesting, and this was done in commercial fields last year, both as hand harvest of this part of the plant, all the way to some early efforts on machine harvest, particularly in places like Colorado. They've developed some equipment that's in field testing and use. Another thing is there's a lot of variability plant to plant, and so there's work that Dan Putnam and others are doing on sampling methods to hopefully provide some information to regulatory groups that might help inform them on how to do sampling that would give you a fair estimate of THC. Again, since THC exceeding that limit would be a way of getting your field terminated or accepted. Pests and diseases, I'll just mention that there were opportunities since we had these field trials to look at pest and disease issues. And what was found, basically, there were insects and mites that were observed: corn earworm, budworms, various types of things, leaf miners, adult whiteflies, ligas that were present in the field. The worst damage noted generally tended to be corn earworm and tobacco budworm in observations both at Westside and Davis. Pesticides legal to use in cannabis. Basically, it's an organic crop at the moment because there's very little in the way of available registered materials. There'll be work done on that, but really even in the industry, they'll have to decide whether there are pesticide residue issues that are a concern that would impact what you would want to apply even when you get some materials registered. And I just did want to mention that there was some work done by Brad Hansen and Sarah Light looking at herbicide damage either as a drift or something that might be a carryover issue. So that reference on the bottom would give you access to some of that type of information. So I'll just finish up with, these are ongoing issues. Like I said, this isn't really a description of research project output yet, but again, it's important to know that there's all these different types of hemps. The production methods and water requirements and probably nutrient requirements are probably going to differ because the plants differ in size, planting densities, duration of growth. There are insect and disease and weed management issues in commercial production that will have to be evaluated on an ongoing basis, and some decisions made on whether this is essentially going to be an organic production crop or whether they're going to actively look for a lot of registered materials. Harvesting is something that a lot of things to sort out in terms of harvest in both equipment needs and labor needs. And then just basically production economics. California is going to be producing a crop that is in competition with crops that can be produced sort of all over the United States and other parts of the world. So what kind of legal and regulatory issues will be out there that are important, and can you make a profit in these different types of choices of product? Okay, thank you.